Hi, this is Jeff with New World Chaos, and I'm here with Trygve, who is Curious Entity on social media, and he's here to talk about a video he made that's part of a larger project he's working on. And the video is kind of an introduction to the Hegelian dialectic, I believe. So I'll let him say more. Welcome, Trygve.
Thanks. Yeah, the video is part of me trying to explain all of left-wing philosophy as simply as I can possibly make it. So I've been studying it. I've kind of been studying it involuntarily since about 2016 when it really got my attention, and I've been trying to reverse engineer all of the logic from there, and it's been showing up in all of the subjects I've been taking since then, through over 6 years of education now. So I've got a lot of sources that I'm working with and trying to fit together to make sense of. And the video is basically just the end product of that, where the first part covers the backdrop for the Hegelian dialectic, and the rest is supposed to show how the dialectic was developed by later, let's just say, critical theorists, because that's basically what left-wing philosophy means. It's a synonym.
Okay. Do you want to give us like a brief intro for somebody completely new that wants to find their way in somehow?
Well, I think to understand it, you probably need to first know that that about 200 years earlier, a lovely mathematician named René Descartes came to the conclusion that we could only be sure of one thing, and that was I exist, and all the problems that ensued. So about 150 years later, the debate was kind of solved with the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant, who came to the conclusion that that we're not actually talking about the world outside of ourselves when we talk about things that are objective and so on, but we're talking about how the world as it is makes sense as I see it. And so we live in the world as it makes sense to us, and this annoyed a lot of people who thought, okay, if we are disconnected from the world and we only really exist in the world as it makes sense to us, what does that mean if we want to be a part of the world? And they thought that basically that we have to reject the thing that makes it make sense to us, which is reasoning, logic, and all of that. So that got to the Romantics, and Hegel tried to solve that conflict by telling them, actually, we are constantly interacting with the world as it is. We just, our models and how the world makes sense to us updates in that process, so we get kind of loop. And yeah, so that's how we get to the dialectic, just very briefly. And the dialectic is basically Hegel's attempt at explaining how things interact. And he suggests that it was part of the whole system of how the world makes sense to us, on basically on a similar level as the things that Kant talked about, which were ancient philosophical presuppositions, such as you can talk about how much there is of a thing, you can talk about how many there are, you can talk about when it is, and those kinds of things. Those kinds of things are what Kant called synthetic a priori, which is what we use to make sense of experience. And Hegel basically added his dialectical model to the list of things that we use to make sense of experience, and convinced a lot of philosophers that he was right. And so that got us Marx, basically. I think that's probably enough for a primer.
Okay. So Hegel got the dialectic. He developed from Kant's model. He developed it into the dialectic.
Yeah, he took the problem that people saw when responding to Kant and said, actually, there's a solution here. If you just think of this thing as another one of those things, if you think the dialectic is one of these synthetic a priori things, then the world as it makes sense to us is in a constant developmental loop where it interacts with the world as it is, and they both change each other. And so we are in contact with the world by trying to make sense of it and acting in it. And that acting part became very important for later philosophers, among what were first called young Hegelians, which had a strong overlap with the socialists and eventually Marx. And so that's what got us critical theory.
Well, that makes sense to me, the way you describe Hegel's description. The one thing that stood out for me in Hegel that really caught my attention, and maybe it's related to this, was something about we learn our own subjectivity through interacting with, like, we have to interact with it in other people or other subjectivities first, and then we incorporate it into our own subjectivity. So you have the subjective, but it also is interdependent with all of these other subjectivities that it needs to develop itself.
Yeah, that's what you call a dialectical relationship, which is any relationship with mutual influence, where both parts affect each other. And everything is in a dialectical relationship, according to Hegel. And so it's part of one giant system that develops and develops and develops and grows and grows and grows. So you get the kind of idea of development or evolution that makes things better and better. And in the theory, the subjective then would eventually become would become objective in the Kantian sense, so about part of the world as it makes sense to us, and that would eventually produce something that does not change when it interacts with the world because it is so perfect. And at that point, it is basically God, and it will work for everyone everywhere.
Is that where the emergence comes in? Because we've talked about emergence before. Does whatever emerges emerge from this interaction of these dialectics?
You could see it that way, and I think a lot of people probably did. When I read Polanyi, I'm not sure that's what I got from him exactly, but he was discussing emergence as a reason why the Marxist idea of how this would go, which was basically the Hegelian idea, was wrong. So it depends. Emergence wouldn't necessarily make things better, and this is something that people caught on to eventually, and Polanyi would be one of them. But emergence is also very popular with the let's just call them proper dialecticians following Hegel, historicists, who would think that what is emerging is eventually going to become God. So a God that is becoming.
Is there anything we have to do as humans, or we just go about our lives and allow it to emerge? Or should we be directing it somehow, like towards some noble purpose?
Well, the directing part wouldn't actually be important for another 100 years when the critical theorists started to think that actually maybe the dialectic is not inevitable and necessary and going to happen. It's just something that can happen and that would be good if it happened or bad if it happened. So you got both those lines within it, and some of them thought it was something they had to do things specifically to accomplish, and others thought it was something that they couldn't avoid, but that was bad. So yeah, those are kind of the two directions you have within it. And what you would have to do then, if you thought you had to do something, is what they called praxis, which was using your models of how the world works and what you think is good, and doing things in the world to make that real, to interact with the world in a way that you think is going to create good things, basically. And in the young Hegelian tradition, this became, and this was even before Marx, I think 1937. I don't remember the name, but somebody at that point argued that it was only praxis, and praxis was a good thing, an important thing to do, because it resolved contradictions in how you thought about things, and thus made you a better person. In the video, I talk about how this about alchemy and all of that. But he said that it was only really praxis if it changed social reality, social life. And I think that largely explains why this is it's only really been about social reality ever since then, because the world as it makes sense to us when we interact with other people, and it is something that becomes intersubjective between us, that we agree on, is something like this.
Mm-hmm.
That thing is a phenomenon between people, right? So it is in that sense social, and so but if it changes social life, it changes that in some sense. So I think that's why they thought it had to change social life. But I really don't think that all life is social. So I have some fundamental disagreements with what I'm describing here.
Like you're talking about nature and biology and evolutionary drives in that too. Yeah, I think about this all the time, and I can take myself completely on one side of that line and see it from that way, but then I can walk it all the way to the other side and see it from the other way too. But I can't reconcile. I'm still trying to reconcile where that line happens, because sometimes it seems like all one or all the other.
Yeah, I think the only thing we can really say is we can't say. We just have to see what happens, really, and hope for the best.
Yeah, I guess, if we're even doing that, like.
if we even hope for the best. Yeah, I guess you don't have to hope for the best. I mean, you can hope for the worst.
I do stuff like that on a very informal level in my own personal life. I look at my past and look for patterns and how can I apply them to my present life to make it go in a different direction. And it more or less works on that. But I wouldn't dream of like applying that to somebody else's life or another person without their collaboration or knowledge or just to like take my own personal practice and start enacting it on others to see how it works, or like that kind of practice would never cross my mind to do
Yeah,
for ethical reasons.
I can understand that, and you would be echoing. If you ever heard of Hannah Arendt,
Yeah.
yeah. So she was part of this tradition long after Marx and all of that, and so Marx kind of separated different kinds of work that we do in the world. So he had, I think it was work and labor. I think work was the one where you do something because you have to live, and labor is something. Oh, probably the other way. So work is what you do independently, what you do to realize yourself as a creator, which is a big, deep part of Marxist theology. And labor is what you do because you have to live, something like that. It doesn't really matter which one is which, because the point here is that Arendt added the third one, which she called action. And the idea of action is acting the world in a way that allows other things in the world to respond without trying to shape that response. And so there's an idea there of letting everything respond as it will. Now, the reason I know about this is because it showed up in this nightmare of a book, Beyond Learning, Democratic Education for a Human Future, which I have fundamental disagreements with on several levels, and which I have discussed at length on Twitter. For people who want to look it up, they can look up Curious Entity handle with the name Biesta, which is the author, and see what I think about there. I don't think I wanted to go too much in depth about it, but the point is really he's made the action idea of Arendt into basically it is only action, and it is only democratic if everybody is constantly doing action all the time. And action is starting to look a lot like basically agitating for a social revolution again, just without any precise content. So yeah,
That's what it seems like to me too. Speaking of education, you have some experiences to share about your last year
yeah,
in education as a student.
yeah. So I've been trying to get myself a PhD application, and I thought that in the meantime it would be a good idea to be qualified to lecture even without getting that, so I could maybe get to work at the university and take it from there, get to know some people, and maybe get some good connections. So I thought getting a teacher education would be a good idea, and I thought, okay, so I've heard a lot about how these places are particular cesspits of radical leftist woke ideology, and I thought, okay, so let's see. I'm going to try to do this, and I'm going to try to be honest about my criticism all the way, and just be a forthright, try to be a good person, kind of thing, and see what happens. And it was an interesting experience. I learned a lot about just how much of it is woke. I mean, I got this book for starters. Sorry about the sound. And read parts of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I thought that was insane, and so on. And I was kind of disturbed by some of the lecturers, but on the whole, I found that it actually worked out pretty okay. Pretty stressful experience at some points, because I got 3 different complaints suggesting that maybe I was not suited to be a teacher.
Over what? Like your political views?
Kind of. So one of them was probably mostly because I'm autistic and adapted to internet culture. And the result.
What is that code for?
So when I say internet culture here, I mean specifically in the context of high level competitive gameplay in games like World of Warcraft, where I was a top performer. At one point, I was top 70 at something I wasn't even trying to do in the world in World of Warcraft. So just to give you an idea of the level of play here. And there, it's really important to say when you think something is wrong and to adapt on the spot, to improvise and just be clear in what you're trying to say. So I would be pretty blunt, especially when we had a chat room where I would basically operate on those norms. And turns out a lot of people in teacher education are not comfortable with that. So I got complaints for not adapting to the culture of the chat room.
Oh my God. Like, why would that make you a bad teacher? That sounds like a straight. Why would that make you unsuitable? I would want more teachers that had that skill set.
Well, you might think so, but the reasoning here was because it made people feel uncomfortable and unsafe, and it interrupted the teaching room. Now, all of these complaints were reviewed, and the conclusion by the person responsible for the review was that I was able to separate the role of teacher and the role of student, and I was just an engaged student, and that was fine. So, yeah, on that note, it was just yeah, this can annoy some people, and it's something you might want to keep a little bit in mind when you're trying to communicate with other students and in the classroom. Maybe this is not the time, and so on.
How
But
do you know all that though? Like, that's part of being autistic. How they're asking us to do something that's outside of our range of what we are able to do.
well, we can still adapt, and I find I'm pretty good at adapting. So
Well, we'll have to talk one day, and I'll need to get some tips because
I think it's
all
probably something people have
invisible
to
to
figure out
me.
for
I don't even
themselves.
know what I'm supposed to adapt to. I can't see any of it.
Yeah,
It's
I can understand that too. But the thing is, mainly, I can separate the role of teacher and student, and so the conclusion from the review was that this should not be a problem as a teacher.
yeah. I
So
wouldn't think so.
yeah,
Like this, I was in the classroom in the mid 2000s, and hearing this already is a huge change. Like hearing all of this even surprises me. I would not have survived at all. They would have gotten me out of there very
probably a lot
quickly.
of people wouldn't have survived. I think that the only reason I got through all of this, and we'll get to the other two complaints in a little bit, is really just that I have written and thought about these things for a long time, and I'm very careful with my words, and I think I
Hmm.
have pretty sensible opinions. It's just I can be a little rough around the edges because I really believe what I say.
Well, are you still on track to get the PhD?
I'm still in the process of sending out applications. We'll see what happens.
Okay.
In the meantime, I'm just trying to make things work on YouTube and look for any kind of small job I can take. So literally anything.
Is there anything you would tell someone in your situation that, because a lot of people are scared to speak up or push back or don't know how, or is there anything you would tell them because you survived and made it through that would help them maybe?
Yeah, I think first of all I would say pick your battles. Make sure you have the arguments in order and that you can recite them properly and respond adequately on the spot before you decide that this is something you should bring up. If you take all of them, you are going to overwhelm yourself and you're going to annoy the people around you, and that's going to make everything worse. So make a list of the things you have, mental list maybe, and pick some things to focus on, and let the other ones just kind of lie. Just make it clear, maybe, that you have objections, but don't push too much on them. That's what I think on those fronts. And seriously, don't be afraid of saying what you believe, because if you just say what you believe, you can have some incredible things happen. And seriously, one of the complaints against me and and what happened around it actually led to something that might be a lasting change at the biggest teaching education in all of Norway, simply because one person was honest. So that can happen where you are too.
Well, tell me about that one.
All right, so maybe we should probably start with the complaint. So the complaint here was that I might be homophobic, I might be transphobic because of something I'd said in the classroom, and
Are
this
these
might.
from students like anonymously? You don't really know where they come from,
They
but
were
it's
not anonymous,
students.
but I didn't know them. It was from an event in a room with, I think it was maybe 400 people.
Oh God. Okay.
So I have no idea. All I know is the names, and I don't want to look them up. You know, I don't want to know who these people are. But what happened then was that They sent the complaint in and got me into the process, and I had to explain my side, and I got into a over 1 hour talk with the reviewer about my politics. I would respond to people in class and all of those things, and I just tried to give reasonable answers all the way. Just make it clear. Yeah, this is a problem. I should think we should give people the benefit of the doubt. So we shouldn't just assume that if people say all lives matter, that because Black Lives Matter says that's bad, that cynical reading of it is reasonable, and moreover that cynical reading might actually be outright unhealthy for the people making it. So if you assume that people who say all lives matter say it because they actually hate black people, what the fuck is wrong with you? You're assuming that basically everybody is outright evil or delusional.
But that's the world they live in. I think they do think that.
Yeah, so I'm saying that's unhealthy. So I would advise against it, and that seemed to be perfectly reasonable. So I said those kinds of things in that 1 hour conversation about my politics and how I would respond in the classroom, and about a hypothetical trans student coming to me in high school, confiding the secret. My response was something like, I would acknowledge that it was something that was scary to talk about. It might be scary to talk about. I would acknowledge that it might be something that they would want help with, but I would also say that until they're adults, it would be out of my purview as a teacher to actually do anything in that, and that it would feel like I would overstep the boundaries, and so I would recommend that they talk to the parents about it, give the parents a chance to figure out with them what was actually going on. Note the possibility that they might regret the decision they make about this, and that they should be very careful about making decisions. And say that if they want to talk about this more, I would be somebody they could talk to. Just so they could get that little bit of mental support, no matter what it would turn into. Because I would not want to say they should go this way or that way. I would just make sure they know the gravity of the choice.
Yeah, I don't know what any of that's in a teacher's job description in the first place. It's certainly
well,
not
it is now. It is now. That's kind of the thing. So you have to be there for the child no matter what, and they basically think that this is part of
for
just
their
being
education, their educational needs. But
yeah. But a
all
lot of
the
that
other
is
stuff
now
they're tacking
seem to
on.
be about just taking care of them, making sure that they feel safe and included. Because the idea is basically that if that's just an order, the rest will basically just emerge on its own by the natural curiosity of the child. This might just be resource influence going very deep in the field, since a lot of people seem to love him. But in any case, that's just the fact of how it looks right now.
Are you still trying to go into education and teach?
Well, I think that's a key part of any professorate. So
At
not
university
not
level,
yeah
though.
yeah preferably. But I'm also applying for teaching jobs to see what happens and just get something.
Oh wow, okay. Well,
But the point here was that the people making this complaint, they after having sent a review, I guess they thought that they had got me or something, because they started talking about it as if their interpretation of what had gone on was right, which it just straight out wasn't. It was happening in a group chat with 400 people, maybe 20 people interacted, and I said things that were a little incendiary, but that nobody could say were actually wrong. And I even got the support of one of the people who hypothetically would be attacked, said, yeah, this is actually right. It's a complicated issue, and we should acknowledge that it's complicated.
do they show you what you actually said? Like they have your words?
I was told afterwards that the reviewer had the entire chat exchange and could check what I said up with that and compare. And the end conclusion was that I was entirely in the right and had been misunderstood. But I should probably think about how many people might respond in the future, and maybe try to be even more careful with how I phrase it.
Okay. Well, it's good that you're good at that then.
Yeah, but the
couldn't do
rumors
it.
spread. The rumors spread, and he noticed the rumors about somebody who was clearly me. I hadn't heard them, but he noticed them and talked to me about it a couple of months later. And it got him so mad because he knew of other stories about people who had their lives ruined by rumors. That that we got into talk. What could we do about this? And I suggested that if he thought it was this serious, he should probably make sure that the students knew about it so they could take it seriously. and we talked about how that might be done, and we talked about the possibility that he might introduce it as something that would actually be grounds for complaint, and getting them just saying outright, if you do this kind of thing, if you spread rumors about potential colleagues without proper evidence, you're actually not qualified to be a teacher, and you shouldn't get the qualification if you can't stop that. So was talking about making that clear to the students from the first day at the institution, from here on out. So that might be a lasting change in how the process works there, in a way that actually seriously hampers the way that the woke brigade get in there and get rid of all their opponents, get rid of the dissenters, by spreading false rumors, which they've been doing since the 80s at the very least. So getting this kind of change in the institution just because I was honest and just said what I meant, that's pretty amazing, I think.
It is amazing. I'm trying to figure out how to replicate it, because it sounds like a miracle.
It does. I still can hardly believe it myself, but it's just what happened. Now there was one more case too. That one was a bit less about the woke stuff. I think it's a bit more personal, but I think I can say some things about it still. So there was a group project, and somebody affiliated with that group project was very close with many members of the group, and those members of the group had we had a bit of a misunderstanding, since they didn't really understand what it meant that I was autistic, which I tried to make clear to them, but hadn't understood that they hadn't understood properly. And so when I asked them to be clear about it, if they thought I did something wrong, so I could account for it, since being the one who doesn't understand, it's a lot easier for me to adapt to them than for everybody to adapt to me. Not least since I'm not the only autist, and autists aren't exactly the same. So they didn't really understand this, and thought that they could just excuse it and should talk about it because I was autistic, and that got them boiling over. And this person who was close to some of them got the complaints and forwarded to the institution as grounds for a closer review and follow up. And the conclusion there was, yeah, there is something you can probably work on here, just to be better at teamwork with people and be clear about what autism means and so on, so they can work with you and they know what to expect, and you make it as tolerable for them as possible as well, just because you're going to be in teamwork for the rest of your life in some way or another. So it's just something you need to be able to do. And also that the complaint that had been filtered through 2 levels at this point was extremely exaggerated and put me in a far more negative light than was reasonable, to the point of straight out interpreting things I said as the opposite of what I said.
This was the same group?
It was with the group, but it wasn't anybody in the group who made the complaint.
Wait, the complaint was made by somebody not even in the group?
The complaint was made by somebody close to a lot of people in the group,
but not a part of the actual group.
Who heard their desperation at not feeling like they could talk to me about what frustrated them about me.
Wow, I don't know why this bothers me so much. Not only hearing that it was from a third party, but their advice to the autistic person of how to handle the situation and what to do. I hate hearing these kind of stories.
What would you have preferred it to be then? What would you think would be the right thing to happen in that situation?
Well, if you're the only autistic person there, the first thing I'm getting, like, I know how vulnerable it is, and I know how people tend to gang up on that one person because they're at the disadvantage. So my first thought was, well, this is them ganging up on the autistic, just the group in general. And I don't know when I'm in a group, I don't think about that stuff. I just interact like whatever way feels normal to me, and we all adjust to each other. I don't know what else they want from us or what they want us to do, but apparently there's something we're not doing that if we just did would change the outcome, and they want us to figure out and know what that thing is.
Yeah, and the thing is that the reason they want it is because everybody else figures it out. So in this case, for example, we had a discussion in the group, and I recounted the entirety of the discussion and not just the decision, because I had problems with it, but I said, yeah, this is what we decided, and we agreed that we should continue on those terms, given that we decided, even though there might be some some disagreements in the group still. So I just recounted the entire reasoning process that got us there, and this made it sound like the group was in conflict, and this embarrassed many people in the group. So that's one of the reasons why they were frustrated, because they wanted the group to seem like it was all on the same page.
It would be interesting to discover the demographics of this group, because I have a thing there's other factors at play besides just general group dynamics and one autistic person.
At the very least, I suspect that one of the people involved. This became a very strong suspicion much later in the project, because it was actually a big project. We're talking months. But much later in the project, I started to suspect that one of the people in the group was kind of feeling threatened by how many things I knew about how many different things and just how confident I was about it.
Mm-hmm.
To the point where, we would write a report together, and I would go over the report and just try to tighten up the language, because we had a hard limit at 9,000 words, and we had 13,000 words by the time I was halfway through everything. And I was trying to cut it down, and I managed to remove 4,000 words. But he looked at one paragraph and thought, "Hang on, I think you removed too much here. I liked what was there before. Can't we just get that back?" And I said, "Sure. How do you want it to be? What do you think is missing? We can fix this." And he wasn't happy before he wrote it entirely by himself. And even then, I asked third parties about this as well, and their conclusion was that what I had written was the gold standard of shortening it down and retaining the essence. So that just feels like he really wanted it to not be me who did it.
So it was just ego?
It feels like that, yeah.
Because you seem so normal to me and professional. Like I feel like I could stick you in any group and you would just shine. So hearing that your social skills are somehow inhibiting your ability to collaborate, it just is shocking to me, because I've interacted with you on Zoom.
I appreciate that, but what can I say? People are different.
Yeah, they are. That's why I don't think I think they try to make the problem more about us than it actually is, and without looking at all the other factors that could be involved.
Maybe. There's certainly an argument to be made for some people in the group maybe having some kind of tendency towards a bipolar disorder or something. Certainly an argument to be made for something like that, but I think that's an argument that can be made about a lot of the population at universities today. So nothing special about these people in particular, just the kind of environment and mentality that is fostered at universities when they try to be ridiculously inclusive of everything. Inclusion is nice to a point, but when you start enabling and encouraging psychological issues, it kind of goes overboard. And that's also kind of why I'm perfectly happy to just be the one who tries to adapt, knowing that I am different in a few more ways than most people are.
Well, my hat's off.
Not going to be part of that problem.
If you're able to do that.
Well, able. Let me just say that through this process with all these complaints, there was a lot of crying. Pretty rough, very, very personal stuff. Not fun at all. And I mean, just having a 2-hour conversation to go over these kinds of events, of which one part is just about my personal views and opinions and how I'd respond to difficult situations. When about half of at least one of these complaints was just personal attacks based on falsehoods, twisted statements and all these kinds of things, that's rough, not fun at all. And I think that these kind of things are probably something you can expect to get a little bit of if you try to just be forthright and honest about not being woke in these kinds of institutions. However, I think it can be worth it, given my own experiences.
Do you feel okay, like now, like the complaints are over and you've pretty much integrated and adjusted, or do you still have the feeling that a complaint can hit you at any moment?
Well, since it went through that review process, I've basically gotten the stamp of approval from the institution in more ways than the others. So I've been checked for these kinds of things, and the conclusion was, yeah, this guy is absolutely fine on this. And moreover, their evaluation was that I was a tremendous resource, that they really wanted to get recognized as qualified teacher and all of that. So I got a stamp of approval for the way I was behaving over there. So if I keep going as that, I've basically got that institution, especially the people who are responsible for that decision, behind me, which means I've got institutional support and an institution that is basically obligated on its own reputation to stand up for me if people spread false rumors about me in the future. So I think I got a pretty good spot as a result of this.
Wow.
Absolutely amazing, don't you think?
That's yes, that is an amazing story. But hopefully other people can take from that example.
Hopefully.
Like, I'm still trying to figure how you made it work, but it's a great story to hear.
I know I'm better with words than most people I interact with, but I still think that for a lot of people it will be just fine if you just make sure you don't say anything you don't believe, and you just try to be a good person. I think that's going to get you very far.
That's all I've done. That's pretty much all I've used. I don't know how far it's got me, but that's been my compass, and it's worked out on an internal level. Like, I don't have a lot of internal conflict about how I live my life. It hasn't always worked out socially.
Yeah. So if we return to the video and the topic of the dialectic a little bit more, so part of the idea there is that you have to engage in praxis to change social life in order to resolve internal contradictions and become a better person. Since this is part of the greater inspiration in alchemy and all of that, where you kind of have to bring yourself through a spiritual refinement process to become somebody who is more and more like the Messiah. We could say that if you actually want to do something like that, the most important thing you can do about it is just be honest. Know what you are, know what you stand on, try to make all parts of you align, this kind of Jordan Peterson stuff, and that way, what is actually being tested is actually you, which means that what is actually being responded to is actually you, which means that you are the thing that is getting improved on instead of some kind of lie or mask.
How do you what's the criterion that you use to determine if it's really you, or if it's something false from the outside?
I can't really say that with confidence, but I can say that ever since I was a young teenager, around 14 years old, I made myself a promise, and that promise was to only say things I thought I could defend. So that is very close to the thing Peterson's been recommending from a little bit more recently, with don't say things that make you weak. It's a bit like that, because if you feel like you can't defend it, then you're building and building and building on top of that, and so you're growing more powerful rhetorically or something like that. So I've been doing that for over 10 years now, and I don't really know. I test it, test and test and test and test and see what happens.
Well, the dialectic and the interaction, are you conscious as you're going through your daily life? Are you conscious about your interactions with the dialectic? Are you like consciously taking the feedback and incorporating it, or is it just a process that runs in the background that you're aware of but you don't have to really do anything with?
I think this very easily gets into kind of authenticity dilemma. If for people who have watched one of the James Lindsay New Discourses podcast about the crisis of authenticity, I think that kind of question is what gets people into that crisis. So I would just say this is the game. If you know the internet meme, the game that you lose by thinking about the game. I would say that is literally what authenticity and being the real you is all about. If you think about it, you're not being the real you as long as you think about it. Until you stop thinking about it, then you can win again.
I think of that as flow state. Like when I'm in my flow state, that happens.
Yeah. Now, having said that, I've been very conscious when I interact with strangers and so on. Before I was 14, around that time, I was consciously trying to make people scared and disturb them in some way. So I would make nasty faces and scowl at people when I passed by strangers on the street. Yeah, it gets kind of crazy, but that's one of the reasons why I really like that thing from Peterson about trying to make the world better and how people can literally do things to make things worse, which I know I did myself, so I know that, But what I tried to do since then, consciously, is to try to show people that there is warmth in the people around them and they can't trust. So I've been trying to consciously show people a friendly smile all the time, give everybody a chance to smile back.
And it's authentic. even though you're doing it intentionally, there's still.
I really mean it, you know. I really like people, even though some of them can be kind of fucked up sometimes.
I'm the same way. I can't. I wish I could like shake it, but I can't. I just love people, as fucked up as they are.
Yeah. And on that note, I've really been liking Xenoblade Chronicles 2. It's a You may have heard of the game. It's a very very Japanese style with ridiculous fan service to the point where it might even make you uncomfortable. And I'm not joking. It really might make you.
Which one is it?
Xenoblade Chronicles 2.
It's a video game.
It's a video game, and
I don't know.
It's a story about a world where everything kind of is alive. You have people living on continents who are alive, and using them as kind of servants. And you have a really strong story there about a world that is absolutely brutal, where people where you have two kinds of people: some that are generated from the imagination of other people, and some that are just the people who can do that. And the former kind, from people's imagination, after they have been made, they lose the memories when the person who imagined them dies, and then they can be reactivated by some people later. And some people would take these people's core crystals, as they call them in the game, and couple them with pictures of the person inside, and use that basically to lead some kind of sex slavery. They sell them for sex slavery. This is the kind of brutal world they're talking with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. So you have this world, and then you have an optimistic person in that world, and the ultimate point of the story is life's about taking the good with the bad. Yeah, there's a lot of bad things in this world, but there's still hope, and we don't know how far that goes, and we have to be able to see past the bad and see that there's good there still. And I think that game is really good at telling a story with this message, because that world is probably one of the darkest worlds I've ever seen, and it's still got this kind of message.
Wow. Well, I'll have to find a way to check it out.
Yeah, but I'll just warn again, the fan service in that game can be outright disturbing. Like I said, some of these were used for sex slavery in the past, as the story goes, so it makes sense, but it's still uncomfortable. When you see the amount of jiggle physics they have on some of the characters, you probably won't even believe it.
Oh.
So yeah, that kind of thing. I highly recommend just seeing the world and seeing that while there's bad things, there's also good things, and those good things are worth more. And that goes for people too. Even though I didn't see that when I was 14-ish.
Yeah, I've always thought that. Like, there's always good to find in people. Maybe not every person, but it's there if you look. And so I don't have this. I should have a more cynical view of people than I do, but I still think the good is there.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people really believe things, and after observing my own family and interactions with strangers and so on, I really get the impression that there is something to this idea that a lot of people say things that are really cynical and sound really awful, as a kind of test of the people around them to see if anybody is willing to say no. And so when they say no, it's kind of like they brighten up. When you say no to them, it seems like they brighten up, and you kind of bring them hope, especially if you have a reason for it.
You do this consciously?
I've been observing it.
Oh.
So it seems to be just a kind of thing with autists, you know. It comes from the same root as auto in autonomy, which is about making laws for yourself, right? So the self, auto is something that is in the self. So autists, the origin there is something like being particularly in your own self. Yes. So some people might associate that with being trapped in their minds or something like that, but you don't need that for this. I think that another form it can take is being particularly interested, as I've been, in does this thing apply to me? So constantly observing the world and just seeing, is this thing is true of something? Is it true of me as well? Just asking that kind of question all the time.
That sounds normal to me. You mean other people aren't doing that all the time? Because that just sounds like a normal way to approach the world.
From the response I get from random people, it seems like it is a little unusual, at least.
Oh, God.
Maybe more common with autists. I don't know. But it seems like that might be the case.
But yeah, you're right that ought and self, and I've always conceived it that way. Like I take in the world through myself, so the data that's strongest, that's most in contact with my own self, is my starting point for everything, and that's the data that's most accessible to me, and it's how I organize everything else from that point of the self.
Yeah. Maybe there's something more to be said about the video project. So I've uploaded part 1 thus far. So part 1 is about the things I started talking about here at the first, right? So the Kant, what the dialectic is, a little bit about how Hegel, a lot about how Hegel thought about it, and then I go into how it has been picked up by some other people. So, for example, Marx just takes Hegel and puts it and turns it upside down in a sense. So, for example, Hegel thought it would end in a perfect state, and Marx says no, it's going to end in a global stateless society, which in itself is kind of a misnomer, right? Is it a society without a state? For starters. But anyway, so you have that kind of turn on it, and then you have Nietzsche says, actually no, the things that were critical in the dialectic, that were inevitable and necessary and scientific, which made Marx call it scientific socialism and so on, those things aren't actually necessary, but more like possible, and we could just add at best, possible at best. And then you have Sartre and all of existentialism and how it emphasizes choice. We can basically summarize all of that as just as we exist in the dialectic, we make choices all the time, and those choices impact how things go forward, what the dialectic becomes.
Yeah,
which is basically what Nietzsche said already.
That makes perfect sense to me. I recently started dipping my toe into spiral dynamics, and the first thing I thought about when I started looking into it was Hegel and the dialectical spiral.
That's
so
cool.
Even something as modern as spiral dynamics seems to have roots, 200 years ago?
Yeah, at the least. We should note that Hegel didn't come up with the dialectic. He just took Kant's idea of the dialectic and applied it to everything instead of just organizing thoughts.
Yeah. Well, it's from a biblical pattern too, and that Abrams book I told you about traces it backwards to its biblical. And there's some classical roots, but there's the form of the pattern is biblical.
Another pattern that might be related to this, what Jung calls circumambulation, which is something that happens in circumambulation. Circumambulation. So something that happens a lot in conversations, for example. You have an explanation that kind of goes roundabout and just circles around a topic to kind of encapsulate what that topic is and expands from there. The circle might expand, it might move, kind of shift the topic, but you can probably think of, for example, Abraham's story as a kind of circumambulation around his promise from God.
Oh, yeah.
For example, where he just goes out into the world and things happen and he circles around and just does things, and then ultimately it was good enough, he gets his promise. But as for the whole, I should make very clear that while I have respect for this idea of the dialectic, it's not going to come out in any that I'm working on, but it is going to become clear in the afterword. I am a serious critic of the whole idea of the dialectic. I think it's fundamentally flawed in several ways. So, for example, the idea of synthesis, when the two parts that don't seem to go together are made into one, that's not actually one thing. It's at the very least three different things. And you could argue that those things have nothing to do with each other and should not be put together. So that's one problem. Another problem is that the whole idea of the master and slave dialectic, which I talk about at length in the video, that idea, it should be based on master-slave relationships in history, presumably. Why? What else would it be based on? Just pure speculation? Well, it turns out that if you compare it to, for example, the story in Exodus, it only meets 2 out of maybe 6 or so attributes of the dialectic, and there is no reason to think that there would be more in any other. So basically, it is completely falsified, and it should have been falsified by the time it came out. So fundamental problems here. probably more with the master-slave dialectic than with the dialectic as such, but there's a lot to criticize here.
Was it? And there were 3 points.
3 points.
Did you say there were 3?
At least 3 different things that were called synthesis and but arguably had nothing to do with each other.
Oh.
And I can just go into a little bit of what those are. So, for example, you can imagine scientific theory, for example. So, imagine we have discovered a new planet, and we see how it moves, and it doesn't move as we would expect from what we know about the world and how things work. So, we could explain this and synthesize this new piece of data, which does not fit the current model, by assuming that there's something else impacting its field of gravity, which makes it move a little different from what we thought it would. So that's one solution, right? And in this solution, the new data becomes a small part in the big whole that was there from before. Got that? Now imagine if we solved this by saying, actually, gravity is wrong. It's not gravity, it's something else. And that new something else, it matches with all the previous data, but it is not the old model. So then we have replaced the old model, and we have synthesized it into a new model. And this is drastically different, because the new model changes everything, whereas the previous thing only changed one thing. And also could be checked, can also be wrong. And then on top of that, you could go even deeper and say, actually, no, planets aren't the thing. Okay, how does that work? That changes everything. And finally, the final thing that could be called synthesis, 2 of these might have been the same, kind of getting lost in the weeds too much here. But it could also say, actually, we're just going to say, okay, these things, they don't fit together, but they both make sense. They both work. And so we're going to keep both of them. That's what happened with the theory of relativity and quantum physics, as far as I know in those fields. So those are just existing together, and they don't match, but they both work. And so you have the kind of synthesis, which isn't really a synthesis at all. It's just 2 things that keep on going, that keep on not matching together, and we just don't look at it. We don't have to, because we don't see a solution, and it might not even be something we can even test if there's a solution to. So, would you say that it's reasonable to call all these things the same thing?
No, but what are there? Now you have me thinking. What does that do for the dialectic? Because you still have the antitheses. Are there just multiple ways they can combine, and each one forms its own kind of triad with its own properties?
Kind of. I would say that there's probably an infinite number of possible antitheses, and people can forward the ones that fit some agenda they want, something that they think would help make the world better, if they're conscious about it in the way that the critical theorists would be, especially later on, those of the more pedagogical approach like Paulo Freire. But you can also think that because there are so many of them, it isn't really this kind of model at all. It isn't really a thesis and one antithesis. It's more like, this is one idea, and this is another, and this is another, and this is another, and this is another, and oh, here 2 of them collide. Oh, here 4 of them collide, and then suddenly it's completely different. And the ways that might be resolved are, actually, one of them might be completely wrong. So in the video, I use a football example, right? I can say that I'm good at football. You can say, actually, you're pretty bad at football, and I can defend, and then we'll have a synthesis. Oh no, it's not that I'm good at playing football, it's that I know the rules, so I'm good at the rules of football. Okay, that's a synthesis, because now we're both right, and we both brought it on into something that matches, and we understood he's not good at football, but he's very good at the rules. But then what happens if we check and it turns out that I don't know any of the rules? And what happens if we check and it turns out that I'm pretty good at playing the game? Both of us could be wrong. If we just assume it's right, which seems to be what this tradition has done a lot of the time, then we're going to make the model more and more wrong for every single synthesis. And if these syntheses replace the older things that were there before, which is part of the point, it's supposed to uplift, destroy, and also keep, which because it's kind of a magical word that combines a lot of these different things, because the synthesis is itself a synthesis of different things, as I've laid out with at least three different things earlier. When it does this, if it uplifts in this sense and keeps but replaces, then it might just make it so that it might replace something that is not wrong with something that is wrong.
So what's your solution to is this where you throw out the model completely and replace it with a better starting point than?
I would say this model does not deserve to be put on the same level as time. It does not deserve to be put on the same level as quantity. It is suitable for organizing thoughts, and I would say that bring it beyond that is at the very least unscientific and arguably indefensible.
Are there alternative models like already that we could be using?
Yeah, for example, we could look to Nietzsche and his model of will to power, which says that everything as we understand it is a thing, and it is a thing at the level we notice it at the time, which we can look at it in a different way, and then it becomes a different thing. For example, if I look at my computer and I look at it in the microscope, and the microscope is strong enough, I might not see a computer anymore. I might see molecules, or I might see atoms, or I might even see the core of the atom, or I might see the quarks. The point is that different levels of analysis make you notice different things, and we could even say that these different levels that we notice are things that we instinctively notice on that level because of evolution, and that we notice it because it seems tangible at that level, relevant. It seems like it's something that is worth noticing, and then we could operate in the world of what we notice, which is a bit like the dialectic, if the dialectic is omnidirectional, and there's no talk of synthesis. It's just a talk of, can you make it work with the new things that are shown up, which is kind of like it, but it's also fundamentally not this kind of teleological model.
Yeah.
So that's one thing you can replace it with, and that's Nietzsche. Pretty impressive guy when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I like Nietzsche too. I get a lot out of him.
Yeah. So anyway, part 2 of the video series is going to talk about critical theory and something that started happening among critical theorists. And here I think it's appropriate to use critical theory broadly. So really, all philosophy that has an explicit praxis element is critical theory, because it understands its place in the dialectic and has that as part of its model. As I write it in the document that is going to become the next part. Let's see. So the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, who followed Marx and Hegel about 100 years later, first described critical theory as a kind of theory that, unlike traditional theory, not just sought to understand the world, but also to change it. With the context of Hegel in particular, that is to say that critical theorists are conscious of their place in the dialectic and develop theory through application in the dialectical relationship between themselves and the world they try to change.
Would we have critical theory without Hegel? Would it still be possible to have wokeness or something like it?
Not in this sense. Not in the sense that you have to apply the theory to change social life. Maybe somebody like Hegel would come up in his place. I mean, theories, if you know anything about how ideas are spread and developed, the fusion theory would definitely suggest that somebody else might come up with basically the same idea. You know how both Darwin and James or something, Williams, something like that, both came up with evolution at almost exactly the same time. Those kind of things could happen with Hegel as well, and he wasn't the only one active in that environment. So you had, I think it was Schelling and Fichte and a couple of others as well, and they might have filled the same role in some way. I don't know. We don't get to see that version of history, but this kind of of a theory that understands its place in the dialectic. So, for example, understands that it is part of a hegemony that decides what is right and wrong, and develops theory through application in order to change the world according to a specific wish. Those kinds of things are particular to critical theories, and I think that is something that extends to all the things that have this kind of mentality, which includes the idea that the hegemony, as they call it, creates a false consciousness in people, In the first video, I talk about that as a system of domination. I illustrated that as a system of domination, and there's going to be a lot more to come about that. But in the next video, I'm going to give a outline of key thinkers in the Frankfurt School, particularly, and just trace its development from its conception and before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Gramsci, and I'm going to talk about Horkheimer. I'm going to talk about Adorno, Marcuse, and Marcuse is actually going to come last because it kind of splits off into different things there. You probably heard about how critical race theory and Angela Davis have something to do with Marcuse, and kind of just split off from the main Frankfurt theory direction of critical theory. So I'm going to follow the main line of critical theory and not that line first, and then I'm going to get back to Marcuse and a little bit about his line in the next video.
Okay. Is he the one that's influencing educational theory? Or is that Paulo Ferrero? Or is it both?
Apparently the translation, the pronunciation is Freire.
Freire.
Yeah, it's kind of weird for us who are not used to, I guess, Portuguese. But it's probably mostly Freire.
Okay.
But I mean, these ideas are so similar, it's painful. So I can't really speak to who is influencing what here. I can say that Biesta, he cites Freire, he also cites Foucault, and he wrote in 2006, so that is about the time when Freire was well established. So he cites those two. He cites Levinas, who I also mentioned a little bit in the first video, and we're going to get back to him because the idea of infinite responsibility for the dialectical other turns out to be really important for something. But all of these things come together, and I can't really say that one is more important than another. I can only say that they're all part of this canon that is constantly in dialogue with itself and trying to develop a better way to change the world. And they're really afraid of being totalitarian. It is actually ridiculous how afraid they are of being totalitarian. They go to the length of saying that if you say anything is good, that's a bad thing, because saying something is good makes the dialectical reasoning lead to a system that only has that, which is one of the reasons why they're so afraid of reason, as we're going to get to later. So it's a big old mess, and it's going to be very hard to present this stuff without sounding like an accusation at several points. It's actually amazing the kind of things that you can find and cite academics, and I mean peer-reviewed academic literature on in this, from people who seem to think it's a good idea. It's absolutely amazing. I have this one book where it's literally argued that people should not criticize themselves at all.
I mean, I guess they don't have to. A lot of people don't.
And the reason why you should not criticize yourself is if you criticize yourself, you turn yourself into an object of criticism, and any criticism of you is a criticism that does not go to the system. And systemic criticism is what they want. Systemic criticism changes social life, whereas internal criticism only makes you not change social life.
Wow.
Isn't this insane?
When is the next one? There going to be 3 or 4?
There's going to be 4 videos total in this series. So part 1, dialectic origins and use. Part 2 is going to be about critical theory and the dialectic and how they used it, or how they built on it. And part 3 is going to be a postmodernism and how that was spun back in. So I started there by talking about post-structuralism and explaining what that has to do with structuralism and what in the world this is even all about, since none of the things there really seem to make sense on the surface. And then there's going to be an afterword where I try to summarize it briefly based on the dialectic that I've explained at this point. So, yeah.
Do you give finally, any
separately, I'll present a video with my cases against the dialectic.
Separately from the 4?
Yeah, the idea is that these 4 videos are supposed to be something that people anywhere on the political spectrum can see, recognize that this is accurate, and move on from, hopefully having learned something. The point is to give an absolute Steelman of it, where I'm nicer than many of my friends say I should be.
Oh, I thought it was fine. The first one's out, so I'll put the link in the description. When can we expect the second one?
I don't know. I'm not used to this kind of video making process yet, so it might take a while, but my plan is to first just try to get as many applications I can out, and when it seems like there's nothing that really makes sense to apply for anymore, then I'll get to working on the second video. This is how it's going to be until I actually get some kind of monetization system going on YouTube, because
Okay.
until then I just need an income.
Yeah, I know. I'm in the same boat. A lot of us are. What are you going to have any tips or hints or suggestions on things that, like, ways we could take this knowledge and maybe start minimizing the impact of this ideology?
Well, there is a part about that at the end of part 3, I guess it is, where I about just observe that if we follow the logic as it's been laid out here, and as these things fit together, the only way it's going to stop is if a lot of the people who are supposed to be masters in the dialectic at the same time decide, no, we're not going to fill the master role anymore, which is the role of the critically conscious master.
How do you get them to do that? Or like, can they? Will they? No one's gonna give up that role. Like, the dialectic's just gonna have to happen naturally, like the slave, the reversion.
You must understand that we're talking about the role of the critically conscious master, not the role of the master as such. The critically conscious master adopts this infinite responsibility for the other and does everything to accommodate. Really, it's a slave in all but name.
So is this something you accomplish rationally, or is there some manipulation involved?
For my part, there's no manipulation involved that I see, at least. Maybe some people find it when they see the content, but we'll see about that. I'll be happy to entertain the possibility at the very least, but I don't think I'm manipulating anything. I'm just trying to give an as fair account as possible. And this warning at the end is just a warning. If this sounds like it goes too far to you, maybe you should say no at some point, and maybe you should figure out when that is.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that.
And by being as reasonable as humanly possible, I hope that I'll get some people who need to think about this, and not just the people who already think that this is a problem.
I'm I'm hoping the same thing. We'll see.
Yeah.
I'll do my part to get it out there.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the case against the dialectic that I'm going to try to publish separately, that's just something to to just let out the frustration from making this.
Okay.
Which I think is going to be cathartic for the people who see this and think you're being too nice.
I don't know who these people. I thought it was fine. Like, to me, you couldn't be nicer. But
well,
you're very well mannered.
Part 1 isn't really the part where things get difficult. It gets a lot harder when critical theory basically endorses lying.
Well, I can't wait for that part.
That's part 2. And then part 3, I explain postmodern praxis, which is to say a process that is equal when it comes to writing a story that suddenly becomes a text about how something works. Just imagine something like a story that suddenly becomes an explanation of how to use your dishwasher. It would apply equally to that as it would to child rape, which really puts the point into just how broad the idea of postmodern praxis is. It's the same principle in both those cases.
Wow.
So yeah, that's something I'm going to talk about in part 3. And the afterward is also going to talk a little bit about what I've neglected. And there's a reason why I recommend the video from Ryan Chapman in the description of the first part. I see it as a kind of companion piece to what I do here, because
I haven't watched that one yet. I didn't notice it. Should I watch it?
It's highly recommended watching.
Should you watch it before or after, or does it matter?
Ryan Chapman is great. I don't think it matters if you see it before or after, but I can't really talk much about the fascism part here. I think you can see the logic of it from what I make, and you can see it from him as well, because he does a great job. But he knows more about the fascism roots than I do, and he does a great job in the video. So beyond that, I talk about the possibility of a equal cheat sheet for right-wing philosophy. But beyond fascism, which people will probably be mad if I included in the video about this, let's be honest. People hate when you put fascism and Marxism on the same notes. I've been in a conversation on Twitter for ages about it now. So I think it's beyond fascism. Nothing really applies to the cheat sheet. So I would be hesitant to try to make one for something like liberalism. these things have in common that they all build on Hegel's dialectic, so they follow the same logic, and that logic is what the cheat sheet is all about. But I can't do that for something that is a lot more organic, like liberalism.
Okay.
So that's one thing I talk about there, and yeah, we'll see when I get to actually making this.
Oh.
But I
Well,
have
I'm really
ready.
looking forward to it. I like the first one.
That's good to hear. So the second one is going to become more about actually left-wing philosophy. The first one is just, the most I really get into left-wing philosophy or not is just the distinction between descriptive and prescriptive praxis, which is briefly, with descriptive praxis, there is no difference between a model as such and a theory, and there's no difference between praxis as such and literally doing whatever. But in the prescriptive mode, where it is something you can choose not to do, which is the one that was adopted by left-wing philosophy, praxis is something that you should do, because otherwise you're not becoming a better person, and the world is not becoming better, and you're basically just acting like an animal. So there, it's only a model if it tells you how to change the world. It's only a theory in the model then, and it is only praxis if it actually tries to change the world based on theory. So that's the most I really get into left-wing philosophy or not in the first video. It's going to be a lot more in the second one when I actually get to critical theory.
Okay.
And
Well,
yeah.
Is there anything you want to close on, or like what?
Well, as I mentioned before we started, I have a bigger project of a book in the wings as well, but that's going to take a while. And basically, what I do with the cheat sheet here is kind of one chapter of the book, which I expect is going to have something like 9 chapters and explain how communists confused liberals and tricked themselves.
Wow.
So
the 4 videos,
later.
all 4 videos are kind of make up the first chapter?
Not the first, it's more like the 6th or something.
Okay, but 8 chapters.
I'm not starting at the start, but it kind of fits in there. So, yeah. I got a lot in the works.
That sounds like it. Are you still in school, going back to school?
My studies are finished until I get into a PhD program.
Okay, so you have some time right now.
Well, depending on how much I can make the money worth.
Okay. Well, good luck to you, and I'm glad you were able to come on and share it.
Thanks. I'm pleased to talk to you again. It's been a good talk.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do it again. Take care. All right.